Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unit 1 case study on Vietnam. I hope you've enjoyed the readings, getting through the entire history of global social movements. I know it was a little bit dense, but as you see, the reading gets less and less as we go on. It's to be expected in a master's course, especially one so quick. So thanks again for bearing with us. I hope you especially like the ideas and the arguments of Hannah Arendt. Really, really fascinating individual and really, really important thinker to read. So I look forward to going through all of your Padlet activities. I hope that you had the opportunity to make one. If you haven't yet, please take the time to watch the instructional video on how to do it. Check out my example video, play around with it a little bit, and just have fun and be creative with it. So this week's case study looks at Vietnam. So most of you, when you think of Vietnam, think of the US war in Vietnam, right? Very important in the history of Vietnam, in the history of the United States, especially in the history of US social movements, right? Opposition to the Vietnam War is one of the quintessential social movements of the 1960s. But one thing that I think is really quite fascinating about Vietnam, and in the past, when I used to teach at Chapman University in Orange, California, I did an entire course on the Vietnam War. And the first half of that course, all the way to the midterm, was pre-Vietnam War. So there's a lot to explore and unpack. And what we're going to explore today is French colonialism. So I want to play you a little bit of a clip first. Normally I would just provide it to you, but it's behind a paywall, so we're going to get around that a little bit. And I'm going to show you about 10 minutes of the first episode of the PBS Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War. This episode is called Deja Vu, and this part really looks at French colonialism. So after we go through that, I'll take you through a bit of the readings this week to show you why it's so unique and significant.
Giữa thế kỷ 19 và người Pháp đánh ra ăn cướp và người ta hình dung đến một cuộc xâm lược thật sự là đẫm máu.
The French conquest of Indochina began with an attack on the ancient Vietnamese port of Da Nang in 1858. It took 50 years to lay claim to the whole region, Laos and Cambodia, as well as the 1,200-mile-long area that would come to be called Vietnam. All of it was ruled by a French governor-general from his palace in Hanoi. The French largely lived on plantation estates and in cities like Saigon, made to look as much as possible like those at home. Most did not even bother to learn the language spoken by their subjects. Instead, they installed a series of puppet emperors and employed a network of French-speaking Vietnamese officials, mandarins, willing to carry out their wishes. The French put their subjects to work, building roads and canals, railroads and bridges.
Tất nhiên họ có cái nền văn minh Pháp, tự hào là họ đã mang đến cho dân Việt Nam những cái văn minh của phương Tây. Tuy nhiên người Việt Nam đã chẳng cần. Nền độc lập mới quan trọng.
The Vietnamese people did not take easily to French occupation, just as they had fought against earlier invasions by the Chinese. By the early 20th century, nationalism was on the rise. But anyone who dared resist colonial rule risked exile, prison, or the guillotine.
They control everything. The resource from our country. But mostly they took our independence and our freedom. When I was a small child, I got a nationalism already from school. And I always looked at the French as my enemy. My enemy.
Nó coi người Việt Nam như là cái người thấp kém hơn. Tôi sợ nhưng mà ở Việt Nam là hoàn toàn không có equality, không có bình đẳng. Chúng tôi rất là ghét Pháp điều đó.
My hatred for them was pure. Pure. I hated them so much. And I was so scared of them. I was terrified of them. And the scarier I got, the more I hated them. I was an 18-year-old Marine rifleman with the ink still wet on my high school diploma. I didn't want to shame myself in front of my buddies. But I was so scared. I felt like I was hanging onto my honor by my fingernails the whole time I was there.
In the spring of 1919, as the victorious Allied powers met in Paris to rebuild a world shattered by the Great War, President Woodrow Wilson headed the American delegation, housed in the Hotel Crillon. One day, a tall, slender, 29-year-old man appeared with a petition for the president he and other Vietnamese nationalists had written. Inspired by Wilson's declaration that the interests of colonial peoples should be given equal weight with those of their European rulers, the man was asking that this principle be applied to his homeland. The president's secretary promised to show it to Wilson, but there is no evidence that he ever did. His name was Win Tat Tan, but he was now living under an alias, Win Ai Quoc. Win the Patriot. During his long, shadowy career, he would adopt some 70 different pseudonyms, finally settling on the most enlightened one, Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh was a man who succeeded in projecting an image of somebody who was totally dedicated to freeing his country and his people from foreign domination, to the point that he sacrificed his own well-being, his own life, not having a family of his own. To Vietnamese, that's a big sacrifice, because to us, everybody needs a family.
Ho Chi Minh was born in 1890, the son of a minor official in the French regime. After taking part in a demonstration against the puppet emperor and the Frenchman who pulled his strings, Ho was expelled from school and marked for arrest. He left Vietnam in 1911 and remained in exile for 30 years. He served as a cook's helper aboard a French liner and visited New York and Boston, where he worked for a time as a pastry chef at the Parker House. He shoveled snow in London, tinted photographs in Paris. There, Ho Chi Minh joined the French Socialist Party, but when he discovered the anti-colonial writings of Lenin, he became a communist. He was invited to Moscow to study, underwent training as a Soviet agent, was sometimes criticized for being a nationalist first, a communist second, and then was dispatched to China to organize a cell of other Vietnamese exiles and help establish the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. Through it all, he was taut and quivering, a friend remembered, with only one thought: his country, Vietnam.
Okay, so that's just a little bit of a clip for you to understand a bit of the context. Of course, we could read an entire book on that. But one thing I wanted to share with you real quick was some of the Vietnamese nationalists that you're going to be reading. So Ho Chi Minh is the one that we know, right? And very fascinating life, the one who eventually led against the United States in the Vietnam War there. But there are a lot of other competing ideas of Vietnamese nationalism that were taking place at the time. So I do want you to read this newer piece by Kevin Pham, Violence in Vietnamese Anti-Colonialism, first. That'll give you a little bit of setup and a little bit of the names. Then we're going to read some excerpts from the sources of the Vietnamese tradition. So these are all different people or organizations that had different visions for what a nationalist Vietnam would look like. And I think it's really fascinating because it shows a more complex vision of competing visions of nationalism. So for example, you had those Vietnamese nationalists that were appealing to French ideas of égalité, fraternité, and liberté, and saying they were being excluded from that. So adopting the philosophies of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and other French thinkers that they learned in elite schools to describe their unfreedom to their colonial oppressor. There were others who took a more violent path and said violence was the only way necessary because colonialism is violence. And some even appealed, saying that we used to be colonizers in the past of our neighbors. Now we are the colonized. So they appealed to their own colonial past, saying that they had lost something. There were again others that appealed to the kind of long tradition of Confucianism and the Mandarins and that kind of Chinese influence, something that had been in place in their governing system prior to French colonialism. There was also an interesting movement in the early 1900s called the Go East movement. And there was a number of Vietnamese thinkers who went to study in Japan. And there was a big allure of Japan. Japan was modernizing very quickly. And essentially the idea amongst this Go East movement of Vietnamese nationalists was, why are we being colonized by these Europeans? We should look toward our Eastern Asian brothers to understand how to advance, and we'd rather be colonized by them almost. So really, really fascinating dynamics. Some other thinkers as well talked about how they would prefer kind of a different model, more like the British ruled in India at the time. They would have a lot more independence. And so you get to see by reading these short excerpts from these various Vietnamese thinkers, how they articulated their ideas of freedom. So Kevin Pham gives you a good overview and setup of that and the idea of violence in that. And then you get to read a little bit of contextualization and their own letters. So please take the time to read these. Pham Boi Chau, A Letter from Abroad Written in Blood, very, very powerful. Also looking at the ideas of Phan Chu Trinh and monarchy and democracy quite well. Nguyen Tai Hoc, his letter to the French Chamber of Deputies, really powerful. These are short readings, but I think really interesting, and the ways in which we think about colonialism can be challenged, right? The ways in which you articulate a vision for a nation that has never existed. You saw in the video there, Ho Chi Minh was trying to appeal to Woodrow Wilson and those ideals. He was rejected there. He was rejected by the French and ultimately embraced by the Soviets, though, as Kevin Pham actually talks about in some of his work as well, he was quite disappointed with the Soviets because Ho Chi Minh would always say he was a nationalist first and a communist second. He cared more about Vietnam. right? And then this idea of him kind of exploded with the defeat of the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Really fascinating battle for those of you that are interested. I linked in my Padlet to a documentary about that if you're more interested in kind of military history, and is an interesting premonition for the US experience in Vietnam shortly thereafter. So I'll leave you there. Enjoy the readings on Vietnam. I hope you find it really fascinating for this cool historic case that has unique American linkages, but just before our arrival. So thank you all, and we will see you next week.